Good morning, friends. Today's reading is from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 5 to 12. This reading is taken from the New Revised Standard Version. Is such the fast that I choose, a day to humble oneself? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in a sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this fast that I choose to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, "Here I am." If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. Amen.
Thank you for reading that in that way. My colleague Judy Chapman used to say to me that Isaiah 58 I used to say it's one of my favorite passages. She says, they're all your favorite passages. But that certainly is one of the ones that I go back to again and again and again because I think it's so evocative of our calling. Walter Brueggemann is a widely read and deeply respected Old Testament theologian whose writing continues to inspire. I think he's written over 100 books and he's about 150 years old. Well, he's not that old, but he's really pushing it. But he continues to write and inspire people throughout the world, really. And he says this about being prophets. The prophetic tasks of the church are to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion, to grieve in a society that practices denial, and to express hope in a society that lives in despair. That's the prophetic calling. Truth, grieving, and hope in the society in which we live. Now, this understanding of the biblical faith and the role of the church has been at the core of my working life, my ministry, if you will, for 50 years. Yeah, I know I don't look that old, but for 50 years, this has really been the calling card for me. Ever since graduating from seminary in Chicago 50 years ago, 1968, the year that Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated, both events having a profound impact on my life, as I saw both as being prophets in their time. My 3 years in Chicago were intense exposure, really, to the church and all denominations of the church in Chicago, bearing prophetic witness to the three scourges of that time in the 1960s: poverty, the Vietnam War, and racism. Those were the three major issues gripping not only the United States, but the world, really, in many different ways. Still do, in a way, don't they? But I saw the churches fully engaged, giving leadership in prophetic witness to try to address those three things. Martin Luther King actually acted on his belief, and this is a quote from him, that the church must be the conscience of the state. Not just holding the state's hand, not just the comforting of the state, the conscience of the state. So in all the expressions of my ministry, and I've been working in the church, basically in the church and related places for 50 years, in all the expressions, 3 congregations, a senior administrator for the church in Alberta, and moderator for 3 years, the national leader for 3 years, the prophetic witness has grounded me out of that experience in Chicago. It's really defined all of what I did in 3 congregations as well as in the other positions. And Isaiah is one of the Older Testament prophets who is quite clear. There's lots of them. There's Jeremiah, Micah, Amos. I mean, the wonderful people who challenge us deeply. But Isaiah is one of them. And what he says in this passage is that when we address the oppressions of our society, whatever they are, seeking justice and hope, we become like a watered garden in a desert. Beautiful Mideast imagery. You got to realize this is written in the Middle East, a lot of which is desert. Water is so precious. So when Isaiah says, when you do justice, when you break the yoke of oppression and all these things, you're like a watered garden in a parched land. What a beautiful image for that prophetic calling. And so it's what Sheena talked about as well last week. She referred to it last week when she said, and this is almost a quote, that we are invited to challenge privilege, hierarchy, comfort, even to marching in the streets, she said, as we speak to the world, seeking inclusion and belonging. And as I say, those are pretty close to what Sheena said last week. Now, I know that I get very, very serious. I'm a very serious-minded guy. I know how to laugh a little bit and so on, but in many ways I'm not much fun, especially when talking about these kinds of things. And I can get very judgmental, as some of you know, and you're anticipating pointing fingers. I'm not going to point any fingers today, so you can relax. But because I'm like that, I love the images of Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. There they are. They are 2 huge global prophetic voices, both of whom have paid a huge price for speaking out relentlessly on the issues of the day. Desmond Tutu particularly, not limited to, but particularly during the Vietnam or the apartheid era in South Africa. An amazingly courageous little guy like this, about this high, is Desmond Tutu. But they are both huge prophetic voices, and they speak courageously, but their joy, their humor, and their sheer love of life is contagious. In fact, they put out a little book, well, not a little book, it's a fairly big book recently, something about joy. But you know, so when you're talking about being prophetic, you don't have to just look at my kind of wagging fingers and all that kind of stuff. Think of Tutu and the Dalai Lama, who have an exuberance for life, but are hard-nosed when it comes to oppression and the issues of the day. I remember Desmond Tutu coming to the General Council of the United Church in London, Ontario, many years ago. And he came specifically to the United Church General Council to thank us for our prophetic actions in the struggle to end apartheid. And I'll never forget this little guy standing there with that huge smile of his, thanking us for doing that, saying, Give yourself a round of applause. And with his dancing around at the podium, he invited us to give ourselves a round of applause for our little contribution in the struggle. He was genuinely grateful for our solidarity in those violent and evil days. And then later, I remember Nelson Mandela came. His first visit after being elected president of South Africa was to come to Canada. That was his first foreign visit, because he recognized the leadership that Canada and our government gave in the struggle against apartheid. And then my mind also went back to my own part in the Toronto Committee for the Liberation of South Africa and the divestment campaign, and walking in the streets of Toronto and going to the annual meeting of the Toronto Dominion Bank. I still do my banking at the Toronto Dominion Bank. But the churches and other organizations were in the forefront of leading the divestment campaign to take away investment in the apartheid regime of South Africa. And we won. We were in the streets. We were in the annual meetings of corporations to get them to divest. And we were part of a worldwide campaign. It took many years, but we won. And people like Mandela and Tutu were thankful, not just for Canada, but it was actually the churches and other organizations, such as the unions, who put pressure on our government for the government to take the lead. And the Prime Minister then was Brian Mulroney. He heard the call, and he was relentless himself in working internationally to get that done. I'll never forget that. And we were roundly criticized. Oh, what is the church doing this for? Why are they don't know anything about finances. They don't know anything about real life. Well, the critics were wrong. And Desmond Tutu and Mandela and others recognized our role. Well, yesterday, the General Council of the United Church of Canada began its national meeting in Oshawa, Ontario. I wonder what prophetic actions they will take and what challenges they will invite us to take up. I look with some anticipation. You see, the church, our church, and that's the one I can speak for the most, nationally and then regionally and locally in local congregations, 3,000 congregations around this country, oftentimes has risked being the conscience of our nation. Over the years, we have given significant leadership on such matters as nuclear disarmament. I'll invite you to the lantern ceremony on August 4th at Olympic Plaza, by the way, at 8 o'clock around nuclear weapons. Nuclear disarmament, war and peace, establishing workers' compensation, welcoming refugees, social welfare, the rights of women. We were the first church to ordain a woman in the 1930s. Some churches still don't do it. Capital punishment. I remember being part of all kinds of actions around capital punishment. Very interesting struggle, and we won that too. Poverty, social housing, human rights, prison reform, fair taxation, public education, human sexuality. And as I wrote this list, preparing for this morning, I realized I was just getting started. It was kind of interesting. You list this, oh yeah, but then we did that, oh yeah, and then there was this and this and this. It was just getting started on the list. We're part of a great host of people from coast to coast to coast, not only in Canada but around the world, because we're part of the World Council of Churches and other interfaith bodies who seek the same goals. And then I also remember specific actions in which I was involved personally in the congregations that I served in, the regional body of the Alberta Northwest Conference here, and nationally. Sometimes the price was little, sometimes the price was a little higher. For example, Some of you know this story, but I don't know if you know the whole story or not. I'm not going to tell the whole story because there's other things to do today. But for example, in the 1980s, we had the debates throughout our church, in congregations throughout our church, on ordaining openly practicing gay and lesbian people, since expanded to include the whole range of the LGBTQ plus community. And as a senior officer of the church, I was in the thick of it. I have many, many, many stories surrounding the 1988 decision of our General Council, meeting in Victoria, to declare that a person's sexual orientation was not a barrier to ordination. If you think the struggle is going on now, 30 years ago, the opposition was vicious within the church and outside the church. It was a very, very long, tough struggle with a lot of courageous people. So when Hillhurst United Church celebrated 10 years of being affirming, we were joining a growing number of congregations following that prophetic action. And it was a prophetic action. People took notice 30 years ago. It's a good example, I think, of today's theme, because I saw many individual people around this country, individuals, small groups, congregations, regional bodies, paying the price and being faithful in saying and taking those prophetic actions. Now, as I say, I got lots of stories about that I won't tell right now. But at General Council this week, there's another one called Faithful Footprints will be launched. I'm going to talk more about that on August 5. But basically, it's the United Church of Canada saying, okay, we are going to stand up as a church, and we are going to implement the Paris Agreements on climate change. And we're going to put resources and so on available to all of our congregations, our 3,000 congregations around the country, to join together and take action, be bold. I'll tell more about that on August 5, but that's being launched this week. Another example of our leadership, of course, again, from individual people to the National General Council in advocating for the rights of Indigenous peoples. From the apologies of 1986 and 1998 to leadership in the Truth and Reconciliation process and implementing the calls to action, which many of you have been part of, as part of the Living into Right Relations circle that's gathered in that room. And we've joined many people across the country in speaking and standing up. You know, in my current work, in retirement, my two major foci are living into right relations to follow up the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation process and climate change. And when I do public events in universities or high schools or communities like the City of Olds on Aboriginal Day and so on, people come up to me, and because they know I'm a religious leader of some sort, and they come up to me and they say, "Thank you, the United Church shows up." Not bad, eh? United Church shows up. And that called to mind as I was coming over here this morning on one of those very things. I remember a concert with Buffy St. Marie. There's people here who remember Buffy St. Marie. She's about my age. She looks much better, and she certainly sings a lot better. Fabulous Canadian prophet. One of our Canadian prophets, actually. But I remember over 30 years ago, she was doing a benefit concert for the Lubicon Cree in their struggle for their land claim. And the concert was at the Jubilee Auditorium here. And I remember coming to that concert with Ian MacDonald of the Common Cup group. And we were sitting near the back, wanting to hear Buffy sing. And she came out on the stage. There's a public thing. It wasn't a church thing at all. It was a public concert. And she came out on the stage. She said, "Before I start, I want to say two things. I want to thank two groups of people. First of all, I want to thank the elders. in my community, she says, and the elders in this community. And then she said, I also want to thank the United Church of Canada. Ian and I just about lost our teeth. We couldn't believe it that this icon of the Canadian struggle in so many things, in a public concert, would thank the United Church. As she says, when we call on them, they are there. I want you to hear that. And people are still saying similar things now. In the interest of time, I'm just going to give you one more example. Again, reflected at all levels. I'm not just talking about some nameless national people somewhere. I'm talking about people in in congregations around our country, individuals, congregations, and so on. I'm talking about us. In 1997, that's a few years ago now, along with our ecumenical partners in the other churches, I was moderator at the time, but along with them, I presented a petition to Prime Minister Chrétien. Remember him? Concerning what? Climate change. We presented the first petition to the Canadian government on climate change in 1997 in Ottawa, and we had a press conference, and the whole thing you do when you present things to the Government of Canada, have press conferences and so on. It was an amazing moment. Most people have never heard about climate change, but the churches have been working on that for a while, and they gathered petitions and took them to the government to say, we need to act. 21 years later, the reality of climate change is even more pressing than it was then. In fact, it is not only an important issue on a long list of issues, it calls each one of us, because it is the embracing, I call it the embracing reality of our time. It governs everything. It's the context in which we live. And it calls each of us, our church, our churches, our institutions, from corporations to government and so on, to live life as if we were prophets. To live life as if we were prophets. And one place to begin is to follow the advice of the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, another marvelous prophet. He's right up there with Desmond, I think. He said this about climate and ecological stress. What we most need to do is to hear within us the sounds of the earth crying. Hear within us the sounds of the earth crying. And he goes on, he says, a spiritual revolution is needed if we are going to confront the ecological challenges that face us. Couldn't be much clearer than that. While we were camping in British Columbia a few weeks ago, a question came to my mind as I was sitting beside Green Lake in BC at our campsite and making notes and just listening to the loons and the water and so on. To what does Mother Earth think that we are entitled? I'll talk more about this on August 5, but part of what's going on is entitlement. Humankind thinking that we're entitled to a bunch of stuff. Well, if you listen to Mother Earth and her tears and her crying, to what does Mother Earth think we are entitled from her? That question calls us, I think, to be prophets in the tradition of Isaiah, of Jesus, of Martin Luther King, of Rachel Carson, of Irene Parlby, Desmond Tutu, Lois Wilson, and add the names that you've come up with whom you know and care about and admire to the long list that we can join to be prophets in our own time. As I said on August 5, I'll expand some of this, but in the meantime, may we seek to be that watered garden, that spring of fresh water in a parched land. Amen. Now we're going to sing a hymn, and I've said to many people, I hope some of them are around when I die, because I want this hymn when I die, at my funeral. I want this hymn at my funeral. It's to the tune of Finlandia, and I was glad to hear when they were rehearsing this that the pace was just perfect. It's a majestic hymn. But I want you to it's Finlandia, so it's classical and all that stuff. But I want you to really pay attention to the words. The other hymns we sung, just say this one little thing. I remember as a kid, for the beauty of the earth, those were sort of children's hymns. I hope you paid attention to the words, because they were really hymns of Mother Earth and her beauty. They're not just children's hymns. They're hymns for all of us. Well, listen, pay attention to the words as we sing All Praise to You.
All praise to you, O God of all creation. You made the world, and it is yours alone. The planet Earth, whose sun and its location, amid the stars adorning heaven's throne. Release the earth, but for a life's duration. Yet for this life it is our cherished home. With wondrous grace you clothe the earth in splendor. With teeming life you fill the sea and land. Instill in us a sense of awe and wonder when we behold the bounty of your hand. And when we hear the voice of bird or thunder, we fear the voice of faith can understand. To tend the earth is our entrusted duty, for earth is ours to use and not abuse. O gracious God, true source of all resources, forgive our greed that wields destruction's sword. And let us serve as wise and faithful stewards, while ever glory to creation's Lord.
So, go out into the world with a daring and a tender heart, patient and bold, living your life as if you are a prophet. And may the love of the Creator, the companionship of Jesus, and the power of the Spirit go with us all. So be it, and amen.